Hi everyone, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name is Meg. And today I want to talk to you guys about a 3-year-long garden struggle that I've had and how I finally was able to fix it. I'm someone that tries really hard not to hold any hate in my heart. It's not good for the body, it's not good for the soul. But there's just this one thing that stirs up rage deep, deep inside of me. This one thing that I hate with every single fiber of my being, and that's the squash vine borer. The squash vine borer is a flying insect, and it's pretty easily identifiable in your garden because it has this bright orange thorax. It comes into your garden, it seeks out all of your squash, and it goes and it lays its eggs on the stem of your squash. Its eggs look very, very similar to squash bug eggs, but a way you can tell the difference between squash bug eggs and squash vine borer eggs are that squash bug eggs are usually clustered together. There's a lot of them in a little cluster, whereas squash vine borer eggs are sometimes just like one egg, so they're very hard to see. After they lay their eggs on the stem, the eggs will hatch, the larva will then bore into the stem of your squash, and it'll basically begin to eat your squash from the inside out until it becomes an adult and it flies off and just continues the process. And what is so frustrating about this pest is you often don't catch it until it's too late. Like I said, the eggs are really hard to see, and then once they're in the stem of your squash, they're also just really hard to see, and sometimes you really only notice them when they've done significant damage to the stem and your squash is pretty much toast at that point. Not all parts of the world have this insect, and if you don't, I want you to take a moment right now and just be thankful. Just be thankful, you know? Like, you're never really thankful that you can breathe out of your nose until your nose is clogged. Just take a moment, have some gratitude that you do not have to deal with this pest, because it's just one of the worst. Especially if you're someone that really enjoys squash and you love to grow squash like me. I love squash. It's one of my favorite vegetables to grow in the garden. Most of us that have to deal with this pest live in the eastern part of the United States, especially the southeast, as if we don't already have enough problems down here like squash bugs and powdery mildew, all the mildews. We also have the squash vine borer. First, I'm going to tell you my little sad story about my experiences with squash vine borer, and then I'm going to tell you how I finally figured out how to win the battle. So it all started when I started gardening about 4 years ago. One of my dreams has always been to grow this big Cinderella pumpkin and just feel like a Disney princess, or like go win a fair or something for how massive my pumpkin would be. And you know, this was before I even knew what squash vine borer was. I was so naive. My first year of trying to grow pumpkins, all of my pumpkins died. They mysteriously died, and I didn't know why. I just thought I had a black thumb. I thought it's my first year of gardening. I just failed this year. I'm gonna try next year. My second year of gardening, I had gained a little bit more knowledge, and I had heard of the squash vine borer, but I was like, you know what? I've never seen that in my garden. It's gonna be fine. Tried growing the pumpkins again. Same thing happened again. Just mysteriously died. Seemed like it died overnight, and I didn't know what happened. And I just started thinking, something's not right. This is not me. I was growing everything else perfectly. I had a super productive garden except for my pumpkin. So I started doing a little bit of research on the squash vine borer. I saw a bunch of videos, I watched people's experiences with it, and I was like, this is what's happening to my pumpkin. So I went out to inspect. I cut open the stem of the vines, and I saw it was just full of these nasty little larva, grub, worm things. And it wasn't just happening to my pumpkins, it was happening to all of my squash. It was happening to my zucchini, my crookneck squash, like all the other squash I was trying to grow, it was happening to. It was still pretty early in the season, so what I did was I just replanted some simple zucchini, yellow crookneck squash, and I was like, I'm gonna try all of these different methods that I've seen people do online to try to beat squash vine borer and be able to harvest some squash this year. Pumpkins, they were gone. They were out of my mind. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to try that again next year. I'm an organic gardener. I'm strictly no spray. I don't spray anything in my garden. So I was trying to find solutions that would work for me, and there were a few that I tried. The first one was wrapping the stems in aluminum foil. This just puts a physical barrier between the borer and your stem. But you know what? I planted a lot of squash, and that got really old really fast. Like, I was just out here in the sweltering heat, just wrapping the stems of my squash plants with aluminum foil. I looked like a mad woman. And the squash were growing so fast, I couldn't keep up, and I was spending a lot of time wrapping these stems in aluminum foil. And it honestly, it works for a lot of people, and if it works for you and you enjoy doing that, that's fine. But for me, it was just super impractical for me. I was like, I'm not going to keep this up. This is not going to work. After that, I was desperate, and I was like, you know what? I know I'm a no spray gardener, even the organic stuff, but I did find an organic spray that was recommended that I decided I was going to try because I was just that desperate. What I decided to try is called BT, and that stands for Bacillus thuringiensis. And what that is it's just a bacteria that affects caterpillars, which is what the borer larva is. They're just caterpillars. And I didn't really want to spray this because I do raise caterpillars in my garden, and so I didn't want to accidentally kill other caterpillars like swallowtails or monarchs or anything. So I was really apprehensive about spraying down the plant with it, so I tried something else first because my plants were already affected. The borers were already in the stems. I was just trying to kind of save them at that point. So I injected the vines with the BT. Again, my neighbors probably thought I was a crazy woman. First I was out there wrapping with foil, now I'm injecting my vines with this syringe. Meanwhile, I'm like screaming some pretty colorful words at these stupid little bugs. Along the stem where I could see where they had bored into, I injected them with BT, thinking it would just kill them and it would save the plant and be done. I think it did work in a few places, but like they were still laying eggs. Like the cycle was still just going on in my garden, and it's like I couldn't get ahead of it. So I got even more desperate and I decided to just spray them. That way, if there were any eggs on the vines, it would kill the eggs. I started out trying to only spray where I saw eggs, but again, these eggs, they can be so hard to find, especially when you have a lot of vines going on. And you guys know how squash plants get. They get huge and they just get really big, and it's hard to look at every portion of the plant, especially if you have it growing along the ground or, anything like that. So I just decided to just spray the whole plant. Spraying them worked for a little bit, just enough for me to harvest a few squash, but then in the end, it became too much upkeep. Like I would have to spray them all the time. I didn't really want to do that, so I just kind of thought to myself, maybe I can't grow squash here. Maybe squash is not in the cards for me. But I was still determined. I didn't want to give up, and the next year, it's like the squash gods finally answered my prayers, and I found a solution. And I was kind of kicking myself for not finding this out sooner because it's literally the most simple thing ever. It all boiled down to the variety of squash that I was trying to grow. It's something so simple, and it took me so long to figure out, but once I did, I was swarming in squash and pumpkin last year. Maybe not the exact Cinderella pumpkin variety that I wanted, but hey, I'm gonna settle for any pumpkin at this point. Let's talk about the different varieties of squash. And when I say squash, I mean summer squash, I mean winter squash, pumpkins, gourds, all of that, because they all fall in the same botanical genus, which is Cucurbita. Within that genus of Cucurbita, there are many different species of squash, and this is where we see the variety. There are a lot of different species, but the ones that we grow most commonly are Cucurbita maxima. These are a lot of your most common winter squashes, your most common pumpkins, your Cinderella pumpkins. All of those typically are Cucurbita maxima. Then we have Cucurbita pepo, and most of our summer squashes fall into this category. So the zucchini, your crookneck yellow squash, those are just the most common squash that you find in your garden centers really easily. And then you have the new loves of my life, Cucurbita machata. Turns out Cucurbita machata are resistant to the squash vine borer. Yeah. I want you to notice how I said resistant, not immune, because I actually did know this in my second year, and I did try growing some Cucurbita machatas like spaghetti squash, butternut squash. Those are the most common, but I found in my garden that they still succumbed to the squash vine borer. Cucurbita machatas are said to be resistant to squash vine borer because they have much thinner and tougher stems, which makes it way harder for those larvae to bore through, but they still can. I have a gardening friend that had posted about this pumpkin, and she was just raving about how sturdy the pumpkin was. You guys might know her. Her name's Vanessa. Her is from the garden. She was like, yeah, this pumpkin is something else. It's a 10 out of 10. It laughs in the face of squash vine borer. And I was like, okay, I've got to try growing this pumpkin. I also tried a few other varieties that year as well that I'm going to share with you. But the first variety, the pumpkin that she was talking about, is called the seminole pumpkin. Is this not the cutest little pumpkin you have ever seen in your life? It's so cute. This variety of pumpkin was born and raised in Florida, and that right there should tell you everything you need to know, because if something can grow really well in Florida, I feel like it can grow anywhere. I feel like Floridians, like, you guys really have it tough down there trying to garden. This pumpkin is the most prolific thing I've ever grown in my garden. Just one plant gave me 20 of these pumpkins. That's why I still have one today. It is now May of 2024, and I think I harvested this last summer, so it's going on almost a year old at this point. So not only does this store really well, it grows extremely well. This pumpkin seriously laughed in the face of squash vine borer. Not only squash vine borer, but squash bugs, not affected at all. No powdery mildew, no downy mildew, no mildew at all. Like a miracle. It also never slowed down. So it was a little bit slow to get going. Like when I planted it out, at first I was kind of concerned for it because it just seemed like it wasn't growing. But then all of a sudden, as soon as we got into the deep depths of the summer and it started getting really hot, the thing just exploded and grew like crazy. And if you guys want to see some footage of it on my squash tunnel, check out some of my garden tours from last year. And I also talk about the seminole pumpkin in those garden tours. But you can just see how wild it was growing. It cranked out pumpkin after pumpkin, and it did not stop all the way up until frost. There literally was a pumpkin flower that opened the day before we got our first frost. So at the end of the season, I did have a lot of like little green pumpkins that I had to try to cure in my greenhouse, and some of them did cure like perfectly well, but some of them I did eat as green pumpkins and they just kind of tasted like zucchini. The rest I cured, and this is one of them. And I have a few more, and honestly I'm like sick of eating pumpkin at this point, so this one might be a little treat for the chickens. But yeah, I could not recommend this enough to any southern gardener. Also, the taste is amazing. It tastes very sweet. It kind of just tastes like a sugar pie pumpkin, or like any kind of like really sweet little pumpkin that you get in the grocery store. I made so many pumpkin things with this, and it's just delicious. Another variety that I'm going to be growing forever is the trombetta squash. This squash is so unique. This is always like a statement piece in my garden. This is always something when people come over and they're looking in the garden, they always go, what is that? And if you give one to somebody, they're just always amazed and shocked, and it's just really fun. It's just a really fun thing to grow. It's a fun thing to gift, especially. Specific variety is Trombetta di Albenga. I got the seeds from Renee's Garden Seeds, but it's also known as Tromboncino, Zucchini Rampicante. There's a bunch of different kind of varieties that seem like they are all the same. I honestly don't know if they're all the same or if they're like different varieties or not, but all I know is this one's called Trombetta. This squash is not just unique, it's actually extremely practical, and it's one of my favorite things because, you know, like I said, we have problems growing zucchini, just your regular old zucchini. They are very not squash vine borer resistant, so I always struggle growing those. But if you harvest this trombetta when it is young and green and you slice it up, it tastes exactly like zucchini. So when I grow these, I always harvest the young ones for, you know, my zucchini needs, and then I'll let some of them completely grow and mature and cure and harden into this winter squash that stores extremely well. When they cure and harden like this and turn this yellow, If I were to bake this right now, it would taste exactly like a butternut squash. They are extremely tasty. I love using them for soups or anything that you would use butternut squash for. So I feel like this squash is just so much more bang for your buck. It's so versatile. It's a summer squash. It's also a winter squash. It's also like 7 squashes all in one because it's just so big. Of course, more importantly, it is really resistant to the squash vine borer, and I'm gonna say it's like 80% resistant to powdery mildew. The only thing is at the very end of the season, it does eventually succumb to powdery mildew, but only after you get like a killer harvest out of it. Both of these squash can be grown along the ground if you want, or you can grow them on a trellis. If you grow this trombetta along the ground, it's going to grow like in a really curly type of way. But if you want it straight like this one, grow it on a trellis, a really sturdy trellis, because these are really heavy. So like a cattle panel trellis or something even sturdier would be nice. Now I'm going to share with you guys some new varieties that I'm growing this year of Cucurbita machata in my garden. I'm planting a lot of them. I'm trying to do like a test run to see which varieties are going to hold up really well and which varieties aren't. Here's what we have on the lineup. I got most of these seeds from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. Like I said before, they are one of my favorite seed companies, and no, I'm not affiliated with them at all. I just think that every Southern gardener should just take a look at their site. They have a ton of seeds that are regionally adapted for Southerners, and they have the largest variety of Cucurbita machatas that I've ever seen. There's just so many. Of course, I'm growing Seminole pumpkin and trombetta squash again, but some of the new ones. I've got this Thai Kang cob squash. Looks really interesting, looks kind of funky. It's like one of those flattened pumpkins, and it looks delicious. Next, we've got Mrs. Amerson's. This one kind of looks like Seminole pumpkin, but it doesn't have quite as many ridges. It's kind of more smooth and has this, whatever shape this is called, I don't know. It's a curvy girl. Next up is Tahitian melon. So this one kind of looks like trombetta squash, but I want to see if it grows even better than trombetta squash, because like I was saying, the trombetta was perfect. It succumbed to powdery mildew eventually, so I want to see if maybe this one's even more resistant to powdery mildew. Next is tan cheese. So I've always wanted to grow a cheese type of pumpkin just as much as I wanted to grow a Cinderella type of pumpkin, but I didn't know that these existed for the longest time. They're just so cute. They're like the flat pumpkins that look like a wheel of cheese. Like how cool is that? Next is South Anna butternut. So this is another type of butternut that is supposed to be even more resistant, because like I said, I tried growing butternut and like your regular old butternut, and it just didn't work. So I'm hoping that maybe this variety of butternut will be better. Lastly, we have the Autumn Frost Winter Squash. This is from High Mowing, another seed company that I really, really love. This is an F1 hybrid, and it says online that it's supposed to be extremely resistant to pretty much everything, and it's also a very beautiful, beautiful squash. I saw another gardening content creator grow this. Her handle is Growing with Gertie. She grew this, and I messaged her and I was like, what is that squash? I have to know, just because it's so beautiful. And she told me, and I looked it up, and I was like, wow, it's a Cucurbita machata. This is meant to be. So I got it. Of course, I'm going to keep you guys updated. I'll let you know how the grow out goes with those, and I'm going to be evaluating their sturdiness against the squash vine borer and the squash bugs and powdery mildew. I'm always looking for new varieties to try out, so if you live in my area and you have a favorite squash to grow that is resistant to all of our trials and tribulations here, please drop it in the comments, let me know. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I really hope that maybe I saved you from having to experiment for 3 years to figure out how to outsmart the squash vine borer. If you did get something out of this video, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. I hope everyone has a beautiful week, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!